The Sahara Desert is, without exaggeration, one of the harshest regions on the planet. Most people understand this to some degree, but what's often underappreciated is its sheer scale. It is, by far, the largest hot desert on Earth. For comparison, it spans approximately 1 million square kilometers more than the entire contiguous United States. Now, imagine trying to cross it, let alone build something across it. That is precisely what happened in the 1880s, and the results would be horrifying. Not just because of the harsh terrain, but due to a betrayal that would shock an empire and rewrite the rules of desert exploration. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Welcome to Echoes of Time, where we journey into history's most ambitious and tragic endeavors. By the early 1880s, the race among European countries to invade and colonize Africa was intensifying. During this period, known as the Scramble for Africa, European powers arbitrarily divided the continent, driven by the belief that colonization was somehow their inherent right. For France, one of the boldest ideas to emerge from this era was the plan to construct a railway straight across the Sahara Desert, linking Algeria to French Sudan, modern-day Mali, and eventually extending to the rich territories of West Africa. If this sounds impossible, you are certainly not alone in thinking so. Yet, one man, Paul Flatters, was determined to make it happen. Paul was not exactly the archetypal figure for a grand desert adventure. By the time he was asked to lead the expedition, he was 40 years old and graying, with a fair complexion and an average build. He was known for his intense demeanor, straightforwardness, and stubbornness, but years of hard living in Algeria had taken their toll. He suffered from chronic sciatica and reportedly relied heavily on morphine to manage the pain. His moods could also swing without warning. Yet, beneath the physical wear and tear was a man deeply devoted to the desert, fascinated by its people, obsessed with its trade routes, and convinced it held the key to expanding France's colonial reach. For Paul, the Sahara was far more than just sand and heat. He had spent years in North Africa as a military administrator, learning local dialects and meticulously studying the land. During that time, he developed a firm conviction that he understood the region far better than anyone in Paris did. So, when news arrived that the French government was seeking someone to scout a viable route for the Trans-Saharan Railway, Paul lobbied intensely for the job. He wasn't the most obvious choice, but he was undeniably the most determined. The project's goal was nothing short of revolutionary. Building a railway across one of the planet's harshest environments was an immense undertaking. But France's interest in the Sahara was not new. For decades, the vast desert south of Algeria had represented mystery, crucial trade routes, and the promise of connection to France's southern colonies. Until then, there simply hadn't been enough political will, ambition, or perhaps, more likely, the naivete to attempt such a feat. The primary challenge, beyond the desert itself, was the people who already inhabited it. Chief among them were the Tuareg, a loose confederation of independent Berber tribes spread across an enormous expanse of desert from Libya to Mali. To the French, the Tuareg were merely an obstacle, but to Paul, with his superior knowledge of the region, they were a complex entity. Potential political allies if approached correctly, or deadly enemies if offended. He seemed to possess a more realistic view of the land than his superiors, though this was tempered by a somewhat unrealistic belief that he could navigate its inherent complexities. This perspective, however, was still superior to the prevailing French imagination, which often depicted the Sahara as a blank spot on the map, an exotic unknown waiting to be charted. The reality was far different. The Tuareg people were not passive players in the story of European colonization. They had their own intricate politics, established alliances, and long memories of outsiders who had tried to force their way in. Moreover, the desert itself was no passive backdrop, with its relentless climate and often unforgiving terrain. Despite all these challenges, Paul was convinced that the right leader, with the right approach, could forge a path through it all. And so, with the blessing of the French government and a potent mixture of idealism and confidence, he prepared to make the attempt. When the French government seriously began exploring the idea of a Trans-Saharan railway, They divided the plan into 3 routes: Western, Central, and Eastern. The first 2 were scouted with relatively few issues, but the eastern route was by far the most perilous, as it passed directly through the heart of Tuareg territory, where French presence was historically far less welcome and considerably riskier. Naturally, this was the route Paul insisted on leading. Initially, Paul proposed bringing more than 200 armed soldiers for protection, but this idea was opposed by Henry du Verrier, a veteran explorer who believed subtlety would be safer than brute force. Henry reportedly held a more romanticized view of the Tuareg people, arguing that smaller expeditions adapted to local customs stood a better chance of success. He described the Tuareg as honorable, peace-loving desert people. In reality, they were fiercely territorial and unafraid to defend their land, especially from colonial encroachment. A compromise was eventually reached, and the expedition proceeded, but with less than half the manpower Paul had originally requested. Nevertheless, satisfied with the arrangement, Paul returned to Algeria in November 1879 and began assembling his team. On January 25, 1880, the group set out from Constantine, near the northern coast, heading south towards Wargla, approximately 1,600 kilometers away. To put this into perspective, 1,600 kilometers is still only a fraction of the distance across Algeria alone. The core group included 12 Europeans, some Algerian soldiers, local cameleers, and guides. Just over a month later, they departed Wargla and pushed deeper into the desert, threading their way through valleys and past small towns. Even before reaching Wargla, they were already squarely within the expansive Sahara Desert. If you were to explore the area on Google Street View, you would often see nothing but vast sand dunes in every direction. The sheer scale is truly difficult to fathom, and the daily journey must have been grueling. Temperatures in Wargla alone average over 40 degrees Celsius, let alone further into the desert. By mid-April, the expedition had reached the edge of the territory and established a camp near what was later identified as an infrequent seasonal lake. It was here that things began to unravel. Supplies were running low, and the local population was showing signs of hostility. The desert, too, was unrelenting, prompting Paul to make the difficult but wise decision to turn back. The retreat north commenced on April 21st, but before their departure, Paul issued a surprisingly dramatic order to the captain assigned to the rear of the group. He instructed them to fight to the last man if necessary, to allow the rest of the convoy to escape, clearly indicating that tensions were far higher than previously acknowledged. Fortunately, the Tuareg did not attack. Whether due to restraint or strategy, they allowed the French to leave without incident. As they retreated, Paul sent a letter to the chief of the local Tuareg, promising to return the following winter. This was intended as a diplomatic gesture to ease tensions. The expedition then arrived back in Wargla on May 17, 1880, battered but intact. It had not been a complete disaster, but neither was it the triumph Paul had envisioned. Still, the mission had gathered useful information about the terrain and a river that looked promising as a possible railway route. To the French government, this was enough to justify a second attempt, giving Paul another chance to handle what he considered unfinished business. Paul wasted no time. The second expedition would be a more complex mission. Officially, it was presented as a peaceful endeavor, aiming to negotiate with Tuareg leaders and perhaps even establish a permanent French consulate deep in the desert. However, as with many colonial affairs, it seems clear that few genuinely believed this was its sole purpose. The unspoken goal was to assert French authority, secure vital trade routes, and firmly stake France's claim on the region. In November 1880, Paul set out once again from Wargla, leading a group of over 90 men. His team included engineers, officers, soldiers, guides, and volunteers, many of whom were North African locals with military experience. The journey began with cautious optimism, and on November 27th, they reached an oasis, charting a slightly different route than the first expedition. A few days later, the expedition joined a caravan led by a prominent Sufi religious leader, hoping to signal to locals that this was a mission of peace. Despite this, local tribesmen simultaneously warned Paul and the expedition leaders that entering Tuareg territory would bring trouble. But Paul dismissed these concerns. By mid-December, the expedition had reached a point 150 kilometers from the Tuareg stronghold of Salah. Paul then sent word of their arrival to the chief of the local Tuareg and waited 5 days for a response. But none came. The expedition pressed on, their route taking them along the edges of the Tatamite Plateau. They also passed ancient Roman ruins, marking the furthest point south the Romans had ever traveled, before moving towards the Mali border. By this point, they were approaching nearly 1,500 kilometers of travel through nothing but desert. On February 16, 1881, they stopped at Bir el Garama, a watering hole, to rest. They did not know it at the time, but as they set foot near Bir el Garama, their fate had already been sealed. The Tuareg had been preparing for the French arrival. In fact, even before the French had left Wargla, word had spread throughout the desert, and a coalition of Tuareg fighters began formulating plans to wipe out the expedition. It is even believed that some of the expedition's own guides had been feeding the Tuareg updates and deliberately steering the group deeper into hostile territory. By the time the French expedition reached the wells, approximately 600 armed fighters had gathered, waiting for them. The Tuareg had been shadowing the expedition, studying their movements and watching them venture deeper into the desert and further from safety. Paul, despite the growing unease around him, remained convinced he was protected. He placed his trust in those around him and in the belief that Tuareg leadership would never permit violence against French guests in their territory. As they rested at the watering hole, Paul made a fateful decision. He departed from the main camp with a group of officers, scientific staff, and several camels. A guide warned him that something felt amiss and that it was not safe. But as he had done before, Paul waved off the concern, assuring the guide there was nothing to fear. True to the warning, barely half an hour after finding the well, the group was surrounded. Tuareg fighters, armed with lances and old muskets, closed in from all directions. Chaos erupted. Some men attempted to mount camels and flee, but the spooked animals refused to move. What followed was swift and brutal. Paul and the entirety of the expedition's leadership were killed, along with approximately 30 camel drivers. There was no dramatic defense, simply a group of men caught off guard and overwhelmed by an enemy intimately familiar with the terrain and the weaknesses of their target. Only 10 men managed to escape the ambush, and the Tuareg seized nearly all of the expedition's 250 camels, leaving the remaining men to perish in the sand. The horror, however, was far from over. Back at the main camp, the remaining men had no idea what had transpired or how dire their situation was about to become. The sounds of gunfire and distant shouting eventually faded, leaving an eerie silence at the main camp. When the grim reality finally dawned, the remaining men were left staring down their desperate situation. Although their camp had not yet been attacked, their commander was dead, their supplies scattered, and perhaps most critically, they were stranded in the middle of the Sahara with no viable escape plan. Once the initial shock settled, the men had time to regroup. Lieutenant Joseph de Dianus took command of the 56 remaining men, including just 4 French officers. They still possessed some weapons for defense, but without camels, their ability to transport anything was severely limited. This led to the difficult decision to destroy most of their remaining supplies to prevent them from falling into Tuareg hands. They also divided the food and ammunition and distributed the mission's coins among themselves. The strongest men were given the few remaining water skins that contained water. With no time to waste and little choice, they began the arduous 1,500-kilometer walk back to Wargla. It is perhaps no surprise that things quickly fell apart. The Tuareg, who had already inflicted so much devastation, were not finished. They shadowed the retreating men from a distance, hunting animals and stealing what they could, keeping the survivors constantly on edge. Hunger and thirst quickly set in, and by February 22nd, less than a week later, the men were almost entirely out of food. A few days later, they were eating anything they could find, simply to stay upright. As this desperate struggle continued, some of the stronger men pushed ahead, hoping to find animals or water, but the desert offered nothing. Then, with the survivors at their most desperate, the Tuareg returned for another brutal yet deceptive attack. A group of Tuareg approached and offered the survivors milk, meat, and fruit at an exorbitant price. But money held little meaning at that moment. The survivors were so desperate that they failed to consider the consequences of accepting food from their attackers. The dates, it turned out, had been purposely laced with a toxic plant known to cause hallucinations, panic, and death. Shortly afterward, those who consumed them reportedly went insane. Some screamed and staggered, while others ran wildly into the desert, clutching their guns and gasping for air as the poison burned their lungs. A few were saved by vomiting, but most who ate them were not so lucky. As if things couldn't worsen, while this horrific scene unfolded, the Tuareg struck again. 3 of the guides, who had refused the dates and knew better than to trust the offer, were captured and beheaded. A holy man who had accompanied the expedition met an end so gruesome that it reportedly shook even the Tuareg who witnessed it. As the attack erupted into chaos, survivors scattered in all directions, desperate to escape. This left a core group that managed to flee and continued stumbling north. However, upon reaching the next town, the survivors were ambushed again by a force of Tuareg fighters already waiting for them. A fierce fight broke out, and Joseph de Dianos was killed. Once again, the survivors scattered, breaking into smaller groups. As the days dragged on, each group, under the immense stress of being relentlessly hunted, became increasingly paranoid that others were hoarding food or water. What little discipline remained quickly evaporated as starvation intensified and exhaustion took hold. A hunger more powerful than anything the men had ever experienced began to consume them. It did not happen all at once, but as men began to die and the survivors were too weak to bury them, those who remained found themselves with little choice. The last surviving Frenchman, Sergeant Joseph Beaubegin, initially resisted the descent into the unthinkable. At first, when other soldiers offered one of the dying Algerian soldiers a grim mercy, they offered him some for sustenance, but he refused. In time, however, hunger won, and he joined them. Before long, he too was dead and eaten. What began as a proud mission of exploration had devolved into a nightmare of betrayal and survival at all costs. The survivors were little more than walking skeletons as the days passed, but on April 2nd, 4 Algerian soldiers stumbled into Wargla. A few others were later found along the route, either crawling or passed out in the sand. 2 days later, 11 more guides painfully crawled into the town to recount a story no one could quite believe. They spoke of ambushes, poisoned dates, horrific attacks, and desert madness. Everything they had endured to reach the safety of the city. By the end of the month, approximately a dozen more survivors in total had traveled the 1,500 kilometers against impossible odds to reach Wargla. When news of the disaster finally reached France, the reaction was immediate and furious. The press exploded with headlines demanding revenge. Politicians called for swift military retaliation against the Tuareg and renewed efforts to conquer the Sahara once and for all. The sheer brutality of what had happened shocked a nation that had grown accustomed to framing its colonial campaigns as noble missions of civilization. After the initial uproar, however, interest began to fade. The shock wore off and was replaced by hesitation. The loss of Paul Flatters and his men had exposed just how little France truly knew about the region and how ill-equipped it was to control it. Plans for the Trans-Saharan Railway were then quietly shelved. Further military expeditions into the desert were delayed, and for nearly 20 years, the French pulled back from aggressive attempts to colonize the Central Sahara. The French public quickly found someone to condemn for the failed expedition. Henri Duveyrier, the explorer who had insisted on a subtle approach and painted the Tuareg as noble and peaceful, bore the brunt of the blame. His romanticized view of the desert people now seemed tragically naive, and the press relentlessly attacked him. He attempted to defend his position with more expeditions, but the guilt followed him. In 1892, he ended his own life, an act widely believed to be a direct result of his profound guilt. What remained of the Flatters expedition were letters written before the first attack and scattered accounts from the few who survived. Ironically, those letters became some of the only detailed sources of information about the Central Sahara available to the French for decades. In the end, the expedition served as a stark lesson in arrogance and in gravely underestimating both the people and the environment one attempts to control. For the French, it was a moment of colonial defeat that they simply could not spin into something glorious.